Oh boy, what a way to start my YouTube presence. First, I alienate all the hardcore Dark Souls gamers. Now I'll tell people that fast travel is bad, even though they use it all the time in their favorite games. Well, just like I made a disclaimer in my last video, I'll make one here. Yes, I do believe most games suffer from having fast travel implemented. However, I don't think that fast travel is inherently a bad system for video games. I simply believe that most games that opt for it implement it poorly, and in this video I just want to point out the flaws that come with fast travel when it is implemented poorly. Oh, I should also clarify, this only applies to games where the world matters. So that's pretty much all open world RPGs and maybe some open world action games and shooters. But primarily I'm concerned with RPGs, including MMORPGs. I'll point out some examples of what bothers me with fast travel and why. Alright, so let me get the obvious point out of the way. Yes, fast travel makes the world smaller. At this point, the debate around fast travel has been going on for so long that anybody with a passing interest in it knows this. And usually the response to that complaint is just, don't use it. This is incredibly superficial, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this point. I'll just say, yeah, fair enough, if the only issue with fast travel in a game is that it makes the world smaller, let's just not use it. Okay? Okay. Now, on to more serious issues with fast travel. Bethesda games are, especially nowadays, far from being the only ones that use fast travel. However, they are probably the most prolific about it, especially ever since Oblivion. So, I'll be using Skyrim to point out a lot of the issues with fast travel, as well as Gothic 2, as I know that game almost inside out. Oblivion is actually a worse offender than Skyrim, but I imagine more people played Skyrim than Oblivion. Though with the Oblivion remake out nowadays, that might change soon, if it hasn't already. Anyway, issue number 1, making the world smaller. Yes, I already addressed this point before, but that was just the most superficial aspect of it. The way I addressed this point before assumes that the only problem with making the world smaller is that you spend less time traveling between places, as if that's all there is to it. No. The real problem with fast travel, as it relates to the size of the world, isn't so much that it makes it smaller, but it can completely cut parts of it out. This is better pointed out through World of Warcraft actually. During Legion, there was almost no reason to move between zones. Even at max level, if you're doing your world quests, or at least that's how I was doing it, when I finished all the world quests in a zone, I teleported back to Dalaran and flew to the next zone for those world quests. It wasn't until WoW made his pointless top 10 videos about zone transitions when I realized I actually haven't seen any of those zone transitions in Legion because of that. That was probably the first time when I started to think about how fast travel makes the world smaller in this sense. I mean, think about it, especially game developers. You are making this world for players to see and presumably explore, but then you offer so many fast travel options that make it so that there's no reason to see some parts of that world. This just seems counterintuitive to me. Yes, of course you can just not fast travel, but people will generally take the path of least resistance, especially nowadays when everybody thinks they're a speedrunner, especially in WoW, and take the fastest route possible. I mean, come on, I know people that fast travel to Dragon's Reach when they're already in Whiterun. Heck, I've done that in the past, so of course people will fast travel in World of Warcraft from Zone 8 to Dalaran and then to Zone B. So, the solution to this problem? Obviously just make it so you have to enter a zone first before you are able to fast travel to it. And yes, I know why they did it the way they did it in Legion, but since this video is about fast travel specifically, I'm using this example to make my point. Interestingly, the opposite example is provided by Skyrim. I wonder how many people still remember the QuakeCon 2011 trailer wherein, after exiting Bleak Falls Barrow, the player character would exit on the north side of the mountain, whereas the quest sending you to said barrow was given on the south/southeast side of it. However, the view from that exit was, at least at the time, and as can be heard by the audience, much more impressive.
And then you see the city of Whiterun way off in the distance.
Yes, the big excitement comes from when the audience sees the mammoths and then giants, but you can hear some excitement from just seeing the vast tundra and Whiterun in the distance. However, in the final release version, as I'm sure pretty much everybody watching this knows, the exit from said barrow is much closer to Riverwood, the location where we get the quest to go to Bleak Falls Barrow. Presumably, that change was made so that the player wouldn't have to travel all the way around the mountain to turn the quest in. Why? You have basically unrestricted fast travel. If the player has the quest, that player has already been to Riverwood, so they can fast travel back to it, if they truly can't be bothered to go around or explore on their own. Instead, we got an exit overlooking a lush and still impressive looking scenery, don't get me wrong, but it is the same scenery that we've just been in before entering the barrow, and having the exit on the north side also offers that change of scenery that a new player might not expect. And as I said in the previous point, people fast travel from within Whiterun to Dragon's Reach. I'm sure even with this change, there's been people fast traveling to Riverwood upon exiting the barrow. I sure did it the first couple of playthroughs. So this is an example of how a developer could actually embrace fast travel, but for some reason they didn't. I don't really have a solution to this one, to be honest. I mean, either embrace the fast travel, use it to shove players into situations where they might be enticed to explore your map by showing them something interesting. In this example, Whiterun or just those huge plains stretching far and wide. Or, if they don't want to, they can just fast travel back to town. Alright, second issue, though I'm not sure if this could still be counted as making the world smaller, but anyway, I'm separating it from the first point. Fast travel makes the world less dangerous. This is a bit of a metagaming issue, but if you can freely fast travel and you know there's dangerous encounters at a certain location on your way to your destination, you might be able to fast travel to a different starting point from which there is no danger to your final destination, if you understand what I'm trying to say. For example, in Skyrim, I would often fast travel to a different starting location to get to where I want to go, if I saw that there's a dragon on my initial way there. Not that dragons are that difficult to kill, they're mostly just annoying to fight, which is why I would often do that. Of course, a more obvious example of what I'm trying to say is, depending on if you can fast travel in combat, you can just flat out escape from a lethal encounter that way. Granted, a lot of games account for that, but Gothic 2 doesn't, and I'm not sure that that's a good thing. On the one hand, why shouldn't you be able to teleport in combat, purely thematically speaking? But on the other hand, it eliminates a huge part of the threat encounters pose. So I'm leaning towards preventing fast travel in combat like Bethesda games do. As for how to account for the previous issue with a dangerous encounter on your way, I don't see any good solution to it in an open world game. You could prevent fast travel during certain quests via scripting, I suppose, but outside of that, I just don't think there's anything that can be done besides flat out removing fast travel. Now, related to that last point, we come to the third and biggest issue, pacing and questing. Yes, I'm lumping them together because they're tightly connected, as I hope it will become clear. Now, obviously, Bethesda's game worlds are huge, at least since Morrowind, but even Morrowind's world isn't exactly tiny. I mean, yes, Daggerfall is absolutely massive, but it's procedurally generated with, from what I understand, no reason to actually explore it without fast travel. So, that is a game that fully embraced it. How well that works for it, I can't say because I never played it. Anyway, Bethesda's game worlds are, however, ridiculously empty. At least their quote-unquote overworlds are. And yes, I also know the technical reasoning behind why their dungeons and cities aren't all part of the overworld, but those same technical limitations make it so that their overworld is hardly populated by hostile NPCs at all, and whatever little friendly NPCs there are in the overworld are mostly packed in the little villages and settlements. Skyrim is actually much better than Oblivion in this regard, in that it actually has some overworld camps filled with bandits, and those giant camps with, well, giants and mammoths, but outside of those locations, there's hardly any monsters or other NPCs to fight. Now, what I want to get at with this huge preamble is that because their worlds are so huge and open, they have to allow for the player to go explore anywhere at any time. There's a multitude of reasons for this. For example, when I said that their worlds are open, I don't just mean that they're seamless, which of course they're not. Like I alluded to earlier, their dungeons and cities aren't part of the same world. But whatever, the overworld as such is seamless. No. What I mean is that the player can go anywhere they want basically as soon as they're done with the tutorial segment. That, combined with the fact that in Skyrim and especially in Oblivion, fast travel is hardly restricted at all, means that most encounters in the overworld have to be manageable at any level. Of course, there's giants, which are infamous for being ridiculously powerful at the beginning of the game, but even they become fairly easy to deal with relatively quickly. Which is also why Bethesda uses enemy scaling to a ridiculous degree, but that's a whole other can of worms that I don't intend on opening here. What I want to get at is that since Overworld is mostly adjusted to the player's level, there's no issue with fast traveling around Bethesda's world in this regard. Like I said in the previous point, even encounters with dragons aren't dangerous per se, just annoying, which is why I tend to avoid them. But also because of this design decision, there is no suspense. You want to see a particular city? No problem. Just get on a carriage and off you go for a miserly sum of coins. Which, of course, is still much better than Oblivion's completely unrestricted system of free fast travel to any city, regardless of whether or not you've been to it before. I know in many RPGs and MMORPGs, I'll be looking at the map when I'm at the beginning of the game or still a low level, and I'll wonder what a particular city or even a region looks like, and I'll be motivated to play just to see that part of the world. Well, in Bethesda's games, I can just go there. Actually, this is much more an issue with Elder Scrolls. Fallout is much better about this, as you can't fast travel anywhere until you've been there first, and Morrowind only has fast travel from certain point to certain point. Actually, reading this last point makes me realize that this is actually another way you could look at making the world smaller, but in my opinion, that's not the biggest problem. The problem is that immediate gratification rather than building suspense. You can imagine without option to fast travel right away, you have characters in Skyrim talking about Solitude or Windhelm and describing how, for example, in awe they were when they visited it, or how their family or whoever described it to them, but they've never been there themselves. Then you'd start imagining that place yourself and getting hyped to finally go there when you get a good opportunity. Either you get sent there for your main quest, or you actually decide to walk there, but the world's not scaled to your level, and you encounter enemies that might be too tough, so you have to level up to be able to overcome them. And when you get there, yeah, you'll probably be disappointed because Bethesda's towns and cities aren't exactly amazing. But hey, at least you actually had to put in some effort. Or maybe you are amazed. I mean, back in 2011, 2012, Solitude did impress me, I won't lie. But the mere act of getting to it wasn't anything special. Oof, okay, that was a lot regarding pacing. Now, about questing. It's honestly the same argument. I mean, like I said at the start of this part, pacing and questing are connected anyway. Nevertheless, about questing. Fast travel turns what might otherwise feel like an epic quest where you have to travel halfway across the map into a 3-minute walk in the park. Now, with regards to this, I will say that Bethesda doesn't exactly do itself any favors. They really like giving quests that have objectives far from their origin point, so a lot of their quests would feel like epic adventures, whereas I believe those should be rare so that they do feel different and special. But regardless, if you get a quest in, say, Whiterun, which requires you to go do something close to Solitude, you can just fast travel to Solitude and cut a lot of that walking and potential exploration out. The solution again would be to just not allow fast travel before you reach those cities first. And yes, I also mean that you shouldn't be able to use the carrot system if you haven't been there before. Gothic 2 actually uses an ingenious system to address this exact issue while still allowing for partial fast travel. So, what Gothic 2 does is, as you leave the city, and the city as you can see is right there, there's a fast travel point right outside it. That's to say, obviously right in this cave. However, it is guarded by an orc warrior, which, unless you really know what you're doing, is going to be much too difficult to kill right at the start of the game. Now, of course, you can just run past the orc and still use the teleporter stone. However, you won't be able to use the other one until later in the game, so you have to walk back to the city on foot, as the other teleporter stone is behind this door. Maybe Bethesda's games could have something similar to allow for completing the main quest, or maybe even finish the faction quests. That is to say, they could allow you to fast travel one way, but not the other, at least not at first. Of course, if you remember what I suggested earlier about building suspense, yes, I think just using the main quest to reach those big important cities would be perfectly fine, so I'm offering that as a different approach to this problem. Of course, there would have to be some bullshit reason as to why you can't use the carriage system to those cities until you get to them first, but I'm sure somebody less creatively bankrupt than I could come up with a good reason. But alright, this has really only been about Skyrim and Oblivion so far. Gothic 2, however, makes so many mistakes related to fast travel and questing that I have to believe they added their teleport runes as a last-minute idea. Yes, teleport runes in Gothic 2 are something different from the teleporter stones or plates or whatever you want to call them. They did those perfectly fine. Runes, however, are a completely different matter. Just to make it clear, in Gothic 2 you can only teleport within the area where you are at currently. So, for example, the first teleport rune that you can get is the one to the entrance/exit to this area, called the Valley of Mines, and you can use it as long as you are in this place. You pick the rune up and move on to the main hub of this area, the castle. There, you can pick up the second teleport rune, which, as you can probably guess, teleports you to this castle. So, once you're done with this area and you want to leave, you will probably just use the teleport rune, obviously the one that teleports you to the exit. There's actually nothing wrong with that, as there's nothing interesting on the way from the castle to the exit out of the valley. However, when you come back to the valley in a later part of the game, you already have that teleport rune to the castle, and so once you get back into the valley, there's seemingly no reason not to use the rune. After all, you have dragons to kill. The area is filled with orcs and other monsters, so in order to report to the commander in this area, it just makes sense to simply teleport back to the castle. But, and this is the part that will activate neurons of those who have played Gothic 2, there are actually people to talk to shortly after you enter the valley. However, as you can't see them right away when you enter the valley, it's likely that you will just teleport to the castle without even realizing that there was dialogue to be had. In this case, at least, you do not miss out on any quests, so at least it's not that bad. That said, however, there is another example in the very same chapter of how it seems like teleport runes were added as a last-minute idea. Before killing the Ice Dragon, you get to talk to an NPC called Silvio, who will tell you to clear the way to the Ice Dragon. Obviously, he has no intention of helping you with that, let alone with killing the dragon, but regardless, you can choose to quote-unquote help him. I mean, it's all the same to you, you have to get to and kill the dragon either way. However, Silvio and his buddy will wait at the entrance to the dragon's lair, which is a fair bit away from the dragon itself. And remember, you have to kill the dragons. This dragon is likely going to be the last one you kill, especially on your first playthrough. So, once you kill it, what do you think is the most likely course of action to follow? Obviously, you'll teleport back to the castle to report on your success. But if you don't teleport, Silvio and his men will attack you. This isn't exactly a quest, but you do get a conclusion to this character that's been a bit of an antagonist for most of the game, which you can completely skip just because it makes perfect sense to teleport out of that lair. And this is something I actually missed for quite a few of my playthroughs, since of course I would normally just teleport out, It wasn't until I consciously started not utilizing fast travel that I started seeing all these parts of the game that I had previously missed. There is at least one more such example that I can think of, but I believe I made my point by now.
The ice dragon is dead. And now give me everything you have on you.
No way in hell.
It's me who's going to be famous for slaying the ice dragon. Your small role in this matter is over.
Damn it! Silvio is dead!
Wait a minute. What are your plans now that Silvio is dead?
No idea. I guess I'll go with the other dragon hunters if they still want me around.
I ought to just tear off your head.
Shut that big trap of yours.
Draw your weapon. We'll put an end to this now.
So be it.
So, in conclusion to this part of my rant, do I think that fast travel is inherently a bad thing? No. Especially since we're getting larger and larger game worlds, it'd be ridiculous to expect them to be filled with interesting stuff all the way, especially if those game worlds are open and the player is expected to run between places all the time. But I absolutely think that it should be restricted to some degree and it has to be carefully thought out. I think Witcher 3 does fast travel really well, though I wish it had fewer fast travel points. Maybe don't give it to every village, since that world actually is pretty packed with things to explore, but again, the amount of fast travel points, even if just psychologically, makes it harder to do so. There's also the issue of map markers and minimaps, but that's a whole different thing that's also been debated in various online forums. I might weigh in on it eventually, but certainly not here and now. Now, finally, we come to MMORPGs, games with probably largest open worlds if we ignore games with procedurally generated worlds like Minecraft. Ultimately, like I said at the beginning of the video, if you want to use fast travel freely in your single player games, go right ahead. If I don't want to use it in mine, I won't, and it won't bother you in the slightest either. But in MMORPGs, at least in my opinion, and I'd be happy to hear yours on this topic, fast travel has more consequences than just quote-unquote making the world smaller. If you've watched my previous video, you can probably imagine that I'll be using World of Warcraft to make my point, but as always, my conclusions apply to all MMORPGs, and yes, I am specifically saying MMORPGs. I obviously don't think MMO FPSs or other some massively multiplayer games should adhere to the same design philosophies as MMORPGs. First, to clarify, taxi services are not necessarily fast travel. In World of Warcraft, taxi services, that is to say flight paths, are not fast travel. In Lord of the Rings Online, taxi services are not fast travel if you do not use the instant travel option. Basically, unless it gets you from point A to point B in an instant, like teleportation in Gothic 2 and World of Warcraft, I don't consider it fast travel. In World of Warcraft terms, that means that I only consider teleports as a means of fast travel. Of course, that includes all of its various forms as well, such as Hearthstone's and Dungeon Finder teleports. Earlier in the video, I talked about how fast travel in WoW completely cut out parts of the overworld, at least in my experience. But that is one of the less nefarious consequences of fast travel in MMORPGs. The main issue with fast travel in these games is that it cuts out a lot of the downtime you'd otherwise have. Now, you may be saying, well, doesn't it do that in single player games as well? And yes, obviously it does, that's its function. However, in single player games, unless you're really trying to immerse yourself in the world, you generally don't need an excessive amount of downtime. In MMORPGs, however, that downtime is when you chat in general or global chat. There are probably a lot of reasons why people aren't as social in modern MMOs, or at the very least in modern WoW, but in Classic, I would always see people chatting in various channels, and not just because they were looking for a group. In current WoW, that's the only chatting I see, and even then, only when I'm in a major city. Even the couple of guilds I've joined since Legion, the guild chat is basically dead. Of course, that could just be because of the guilds themselves. I can't draw any real conclusions from that, but that is the experience I had. Now, like I mentioned, there's probably many reasons why people aren't as sociable in modern WoW. Hell, even stuff like better technology probably contributes to that. Think about how many people nowadays play with at least 2 monitors, so whenever they do have some downtime, they probably just look at stuff on their second monitor. In fact, even if people don't have multiple monitors, nowadays I would imagine a lot of people's PCs are powerful enough that alt-tabbing WoW isn't too difficult for their computer. So you can just do something else while waiting on that spawn or whatever it is you're doing. But then, the fact also remains that, at least, again, from what I've seen, Classic servers are always more sociable, and I have to imagine that it's because of that extra downtime that is present in Classic WoW and even in Lord of the Rings Online. And that is why I don't consider taxi services fast travel. When you're on that flight path with nothing to do but wait, you can just chat with people in one of those global chats or with your guildmates or whoever. Classic WoW had basically no fast travel outside of Hearthstones and portals, and, specific to mages, teleports, which were all very limited to where they could portal you, and, in the case of Hearthstones, also very time limited. There was also summoning, of course, but for that you already had to be in a decently sized group. Modern versions of WoW, however, offer portals to damn near everywhere in the world, so there's no downtime for you to get to that new zone or wherever, and with Dragonflight now being a very active form of travel, you don't even get downtime when you're doing that. At least before dragon riding, if you somehow wanted to get somewhere that you couldn't teleport to fairly closely, you would go on your flying mount, enable autorun, and wait, thereby having at least that form of downtime, assuming you didn't want to use the taxi service. But with dragon riding, you now have to pay attention while traveling the world, which, don't get me wrong, is much more engaging and in that sense a much more interesting form of travel than the old flying mounts were, but it comes at a cost of removing that last bit of downtime that used to be present in the game. And I just have to imagine that this is one of the reasons, if not the main reason, why people aren't as sociable in Modern WoW anymore. The other big reason would have to be Dungeon Finder, but that's a whole different topic altogether. At any rate, to finish this video up, yes, there were some forms of fast travel in Classic WoW, but aside from your Hearthstone, if you wanted to use a portal or get summoned somewhere, you had to talk to other people. And if you were a mage, well, you would get people talking to you. At least I did. Also for the occasional free food and water, but mainly for portals. I imagine it was similar for rogues with lockpicking. Point being, adding portals to every major city that allow for fast travel basically all over the world, or at least to all the newer zones, which is where most people would want to be anyway, hurts the social aspect of the MMORPG. Is that going to change? Probably not. It seems like the current player base of WoW is happy with its world design. I know there's a lot of complaints around gearing and balance and all that metagaming stuff, and to the people that miss the old design philosophy, the response to their concerns is usually, well, just go play Classic then. Which, fair enough I suppose, but if you're wondering why there's a big difference between the liveliness of the global chats of the two versions of the game, I hope I provided at least a part of the answer. Then hey, maybe I'm completely wrong. Maybe downtime has nothing to do with it, and it's all just been a fluke due to the servers in which I played, since I tend to play on RP servers. Maybe on normal and PvP servers the story is completely different. But on the other hand, I also play on RP servers on Modern WoW, and there the chat is as I have described it before. So, if nothing else, maybe in your next Skyrim or Witcher or any other RPG playthrough, you'll think twice about fast traveling all over the world, because who knows what you might end up missing. Alright, thank you for watching or listening to me ramble about this. Have a good day.